Hello again, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm looking at an interesting aspect of the end of the British Empire in Southeast Asia, which was the kind of the tranche of the British Empire that collapses immediately after the Second World War. Obviously, parts of Africa hold on until the 1960s and 70s, but it is the kind of the Golden Crescent from India and the Golden Crescent, which is obviously what becomes Bangladesh, Burma, and that curve all the way down through Malaya into Singapore. And it's a place that's been written about by two historians, Tim Harper and Christopher Bailey, in their kind of two-part amazing series, Forgotten Armies and Forgotten Wars, which runs from the fall of Singapore all the way through to the end of the British Empire in Asia, the loss of India, all the way through the Second World War, and the Malayan emergency. There is something really interesting about this explosion of nationalism at the end of the Second World War, and there are multiple reasons for it. The loss of India in 1939 isn't necessarily written in the stars. There's obviously a very, very strong independence, or at least home rule movement, but certain events during the Second World War, the inability of the British to evidence that they could protect their Asian colonies, the appalling treatment of Burmese and Indian people by the British in the face of Japan's advances. Indian people living in Burma were left essentially to walk to Assam, and there was a whites-only policy for ships leaving Burmese ports. The fact that the British were wrong-footed by Japan, and also that Japan, where Japan conquered, Japan introduced nationalist regimes. Aung San, for example, in Burma, and in the Dutch East Indies, Sukarno was a nationalist figure. The reason why Japan did this is that Japan imagined that the nationalism, the Burmese nationalism, Vietnamese nationalism, Indonesian nationalism would be a tool by which the Japan could be seen as a kind of leader of a Pan-Asian federation, rejecting white European colonialism. Of course, this is a kind of a two-headed thing, and very quickly nationalist movements in all these countries don't like the fact that they're being colonized by the Japanese, that this isn't some kind of liberatory moment, this is Japan's empire in Asia, and they discover that whatever brutalities they experienced under Europeans, Japan was capable of even greater savagery and kind of asset stripping of their countries. So you wind up this situation where nationalist leaders like Aung San in Burma gamble on the idea that they can re-ally themselves with European powers to rid themselves of the Japanese, in the knowledge that probably Europeans won't be able to return to their countries in the way that they had previously done before the war. And he is correct in that assumption. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at Forgotten Wars by Harper and Bailey and start to delve into this explosion of post-war nationalism that manages to wrong-foot the British and leads to the very quick collapse of their Asian empire. As Harper and Bailey explain, the British were relying on Indian manpower to help reconquer their empire, and they were going to be disappointed. So, they write, "The great force that now embarked on reconquering British Asia saw itself as a new forgotten army. British India provided the bulk of its manpower. The subcontinent was seething with discontent, directed and channeled by the Indian National Congress, whose leaders the British had reluctantly released from jail as the war drew to its close. Official monitors reported that local people were relieved that the fighting had ended, but were too exhausted and apprehensive about the future to indulge in anything more than perfunctory celebration. Indians, Burmese and Malayans were also horrified by the barbarity they had witnessed during the war's ending and the future dangers it portended. The Bengal press advisor reported to the governor that people believed the situation did not call for such indiscriminate havoc, that the readiness to use such means had lowered the moral prestige of the United Nations. The United Nations obviously being the umbrella term that the Allied powers were known as before, obviously, the official founding of the United Nations. The fiery nationalist apparatchik Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, General Secretary of the Indian National Congress, commented that entire cities, children, the old, animals and all have been wiped out. What a demonstration of the limitless cruelty of Western civilization. Ominously, he went on to link Western barbarism with what he saw as the British attempt to perpetrate differences between Hindus and Muslims in India. Lord Wavell, Viceroy of India and Patel's main sparring partner, agreed about the atomic bomb. Obviously, this is what Patel was referring to. It's not a weapon that any thinking man would willingly have put in the hands of the present-day world. Indians asked themselves what was the point in condemning German and Japanese atrocities if the Allies themselves were prepared to massacre civilians on such a massive scale. Others were concerned with the political as well as the moral implications of the atom bomb. Was its existence so hugely increased the imbalance of power between West and Asian peoples that the mirage of independence would once again vanish? A Bengali newspaper wondered if the Asiatic people would not pass from the hands of one group of pirates to another. Aung San, leader of Burmese resistance against the British and then the Japanese, vowed that no atom bomb can stop our march towards freedom. Now this is a really interesting perspective, isn't it? You have nationalist leaders in Burma and India looking aghast at the dropping of the atomic bomb and then drawing conclusions of, well, will this thing be used by European powers to bolster their empires? Well, one of these, would a bomb like this be used on India if it looked like the British were going to lose India, I beg pardon. And it's, at the time, from that perspective, a relevant and pertinent question. What the British did not immediately appreciate was the extent to which Asian nationalism had been transformed by the war. Before it, there had been movements of civil disobedience across India and Burma. Peasant farmers had been goaded into revolt by the sufferings of the depression of the 1930s. Terrorist movements had flickered in Bengal, and pan-Islamic ideologues had stirred the passions of faithful throughout Asia. Comintern had sponsored fledgling communist parties in Burma and Malaya, where trade unions had flexed their muscles in industrial areas. The Japanese War, however, had given nationalism a new face, a youthful militaristic one. Before the Second World War, Burma had been granted a form of semi-independence by the British. It had its own flag and its own prime minister, but it had no proper army. What passed for Burma's defence forces comprised of recruits from almost exclusively minority peoples, the Karen, the Kachin, the Shan and the Chin, along with resident Anglo-Burmese, Gurkhas and Indians. Burmese Buddhists had effectively been excluded from the army since the final conquest of the country in 1886. The reason given was the Buddhists were too pacific, a fiction contradicted by Burma's impressive military traditions. The real reason was that the soldiers from minorities were cheaper and friendlier to the British Raj. During the war, all this had changed. With Japanese support, Burma had created its own army, the Burma Independence Army, renamed the Burma Defence Army after the Japanese invasion, and then the Burma National Army after Japan's installation of a nominally independent Burmese government in August 1943. One day in March 1945, the BNA had revolted against the embattled Japanese forces, hoping finally to secure real independence before the British reoccupied the country. By now, the Burmese had military heroes as well. The young and intense former student leader Aung San had become the Bogyok, or the general. He was the first Burmese leader since General Mahabandula in 1826 to embody the military spirit of the Burmese people and to be known and admired across the country. Aung San and his 30 comrades had marched into Rangoon with the Japanese in early 1942. The contrast between these young men in uniform and the civilian politicians of the British area, Bao Mo and U Sao, was obvious to the Burmese youth. Volunteers signed up in healthy numbers. Moreover, the war forged links between the cities and the countryside, as the armies billeted on the villages. When the British moved back into North Burma in 1945, they were faced with a militarised countryside, populated by volunteer levies, many of whom identified with socialist or communist thinking of the metropolitan radicals. In short, what you can say is that by the time the British returned to Burma, a social revolution has happened. This is why Burma is therefore ungovernable after the war. To some extent, the British Empire can only function on a degree of consent. That people have to accept their British rulers, or the British use their tried and tested tactic of kind of divide and rule effectively, which is how this relatively small island managed to govern such a large area of territory. But if you take the case of Burma, and we'll look at India again in a moment, the Japanese had tried to create a client state out of a colony. And to create a client state, you have to create the institutions of state. You have to create a modern army. You have to create certain kind of ideas and beliefs and principles in the people serving in that army, in order for them to fight in the way that the Japanese wanted them to fight, i.e. to ally themselves with the occupying Japanese to fend off any European kind of counter-invasion. However, the Japanese were unable to kind of sustain the sort of the deception, if you will, of the young Burmese soldiers, who had become increasingly politicized, increasingly kind of motivated by a vision of a new kind of country that they could obtain. And the Japanese were unable to control them. Further down the crescent in Malaya, the inchoate Muslim Malay nationalism was on the move. It had its roots in movements of reaction to the notion, endlessly reiterated by British officials, scholars and educators, that the Malays were custom-obsessed, docile and passive. This myth of the lazy native was challenged in the 1930s by movements of religious and community uplift, and by a phenomenal expansion of newspapers and periodicals that debated the future of the Malay race. Malay martial pride was rekindled, and even as the Malay regiment all but perished in a heroic last-ditch defence of Singapore. Again, this is really interesting. If you look at Benedict Anderson's work on nationalism, which is obviously the seminal text, Imagine Communities, nationalism always predates. It always sort of follows an expansion in literacy, an expansion in publishing. When you get a polity, let's take Malaya for an example. A colony which is various sultanates kind of bolted together by the British, that has no innate kind of national identity, has lots of sort of regional identities, has no innate national identity. Well, a national identity forms in this case through the kind of the interlinking of people within that polity through a new system of media that disseminates a new system of political and national ideas. Nations are not these kind of magical sacred things that spring from the ground. They are invented concepts, and they rise and they fall, they come and they go. They are cohesive at some points and fragmentary at others. The Malay rulers were not the effete figureheads, pitiful Neros, squalid and insignificant, in one description, that most British imagine them to be, and they guarded their privileges jealously, not least their status as the heads of the Islamic religion. A wealthy state such as Johor, just across the causeway from Singapore, could embark on its own program of modernization. Sultan Ibrahim, who'd ruled Johor since 1895, had looked to Meiji Japan as a model, as had his father before him. Incentives were also coming increasingly from commoners, especially the new caste of clerks and school teachers. The more radical of those looked to Japan as well, but as a nation-state and an anti-Western force. In 1937, they found the Kesatuan Melayu, or MUDA, or the League of Malay Youth, which led and orchestrated by the civil servant and journalist Ibrahim Haji Yaqub, ran an underground intelligence network for the Japanese military. Ibrahim used Malay prostitutes in the northern town of Kota Baru to coax information about the coastal defences from British clients. It was here that Yamashita had made his initial landings. On the Pantai Cinta Berahi, the beach of passionate love, on the northern coast of Malaya in December 1941. When the British rounded up 150 supporters of the movement shortly afterwards, they include 15 bartenders and cabaret taxi dancers. The Malays who assisted the Japanese were not to receive the same rewards as Aung San and his 30 comrades. The Japanese held a similarly patronising view of the Malays to that of the British, but the Malay youths received the same kind of training as the Burmese, and Malay nationalism. The Malay nationalism that emerged from the war would have the same radical potential. In the words of one of the central figures of these years, Mustafa Hussain, although the Japanese occupation was described as one of severe hardship and brutality, it left something positive, a sweet fruit to be plucked and enjoyed only after the surrender. This was also a nationalism that did not necessarily recognise the old colonial boundaries. Mustafa Hussain and Ibrahim Yaqub had dreamed of merging their people into a greater Malay nation that would include the vast population of Indonesia. So the analogy of the sweet fruit that was left behind is an interesting one, and I think in this case it is almost a sort of Japan's final kind of bitter pill injected into the British Empire. The original reason for the war in Southeast Asia, not so much the war in China, but the war in Southeast Asia, was to rid Asia of European powers, to cement Japan as the kind of the Asian hegemonic power. In previous decades, more kind of less fascistic notions of Japanese nationalism prevailed, and they said essentially that a liberated Asia under Japanese tutelage, because obviously Japan from the Meiji Restoration onwards had created the infrastructure and economic power and military power, bureaucratic power, in order to do such things as defeat Russia in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, and Japan saw itself as Asia's leader to freedom out of colonization. The idea of sweeping away European powers had always been there. The kind of the racialized, brutal, monstrous nature of Japanese colonialism, that kind of comes slightly later, though probably there was always a strand of that in Japan's thinking. To give you an example of how Asian people suffered during the war, Our images of Japanese brutality come from things like Bridge on the River Kwai, and yes, white European soldiers were treated appallingly as prisoners, but they account they account for 1% of the deaths inflicted by Japan on Asia. So the soldiers, the Australian, the British, the Dutch soldiers who built the Burma Railroad, for every one of those that died, there were 99 Asians. So Harper and Bailey write, the much larger and older forces of Indian nationalism had also been galvanised by the war. The leaders of the Indian National Congress, the main nationalist movement, had witnessed the surge of popular anti-colonialism during the Quit India movement of 1942, which is as close to a kind of a national uprising against the British as it's possible to get. Gandhi's largely non-violent mass protest against the continuing British presence had been particularly intense in Bengal and the eastern areas of the country, where people had experienced real hardship during the war and had seen with their own eyes the humiliation of the British Raj by the Japanese invaders. There has been various accounts I've read recently which suggest that the Quit India campaign, the explosion of anger against the British, coincided with massive inflation caused by the war. India had to radically remodel and reshape its economy to become this kind of powerhouse of war production, and of course subsequently this leads to commodity inflation. They felt, perhaps for the first time, a sense of mass nationalism, unifying student and shopkeeper, peasant and small landlord, man and woman. And that's a sort of significant point, that this kind of unifying sense that everybody was incorporated beyond kind of class and caste and gender division in some sort of national moment, some sort of national endeavour. When you kind of have those experiences and people began to conceive of the nation, the nation is sort of born at that point, and everything else it becomes a kind of a rearguard action by the people that are soon to be booted out. They had ample time to ponder on the lessons of the movement. 14,000 of the 60,000 demonstrators and political activists arrested in August and September 1942 were still in jail in 1944, and the leadership remained imprisoned until nearly at the end of the war. When they were finally released on the 15th of June 1945, Nehru, Patel and their socialist colleague J. Narayan emerged determined to make up for lost time. At a speech in September 1945, an impatient Nehru threatened to set the country alight. For his part, Patel resurrected the spirit of 1942 as soon as he was released. A final push was necessary to force the British out of India, and this time, unlike 1942, the armed forces, police and lower government servants, all on the verge of striking for better pay and conditions, were also determined to see the back of the British. At the end of the war, Indian soldiers who had fought for India, not for Britain, that's not how they saw it, they had fought for India, saw themselves as servants of India, not of the British Raj. So once again, a kind of social revolution had happened in India in a slightly different way, not one manufactured by Japan, but one that was the product of inevitable processes that took place as a result of the war itself. And there's no way of putting the genie back in the bottle. It can't be done. You can't sort of suddenly take nationalist ideas out of people's minds and make them go back to how things were. And also, and I'll cover this in a later podcast, the British attempts to put Subhas Chandra Bose's Indian National Army veterans on trial is a terrible misstep. Obviously, Subhas Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army were the army that fought, believing they were liberating India, and fought alongside the Japanese. They were put on trial for treason at the end of the war, and many Indians looked on them, even if they thought they would be misguided, they looked on them with a degree of sympathy, thinking, well, you were trying to liberate the country from the British. And they wind up in a situation where virtually nobody, there isn't a jury in the land that will convict them. At that point, it's clear that the British have lost control of the situation. The British face mutinies in countless Indian regiments, and the British lose control over parts of the rest of their Asian empire because they realise very quickly they cannot send Indian soldiers to Singapore or Malaya or anywhere else in order to suppress nationalist movements, because not only do Indian soldiers broadly have sympathy with nationalist movements in Malaya, but they want to remain in India in order to liberate India. So more on that to come, and I do recommend it, by the way. I know there are certain books that I particularly talk about, but Forgotten Wars and Forgotten Armies, if you want to understand the end of the British Empire in Asia, there are few better books than this. Do remember to check us out at explaininghistory.org. I've been adding new content to the site, particularly for students. I'll put a link down below. And we've got some fantastic interviews coming up in the next few weeks, so keep your eyes out for them. Anyway, thanks so much for listening and allowing me to talk about one of my favourite books, and I will catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Thanks very much. All the best. Bye-bye.